All right. Good morning. It's 6:04 a.m. and we're going to finish off Tim Ingold's 2013 Dreaming of Dragons. There's just about, maybe 6 pages left or something. All right, where is it? Where did we stop? Okay. I think I stopped at the next heading called Science and Silence. It seems then that as the pages lost their voice with the onset of the modern era, so the book of nature was also silenced. No longer does it speak to us or tell us things. And yet this allegedly silent nature can be, and often is, a deafeningly noisy place. As philosopher Stephen Vogel observes, the world of nature abounds in movement and gesture, much of which is manifested as sound. Think of the clap of thunder and the howling of the wind, the cracking of ice and the roar of the waterfall, the rustling of trees and the call of birds. We may furthermore admit that at one level human talk may also be understood as vocal gesture, and that the voice manifests human presence just as the call manifests the presence of the bird and the clap the presence of thunder. On this level, voice, call, and thunder are ontologically equivalent. As the voice is human being in its sonic manifestation, so the call is the bird and the clap is thunder. Yet none of this, Vogel maintains, warrants the conclusion that natural entities actually converse with human beings, let alone with one another. This is for 2 principal reasons. Firstly, conversation requires participants to attend and respond, in turn, to one another. Humans do indeed attend and respond to the sounds of nature. They listen out for bird calls and are moved, even terrified, by thunder. But does nature, Vogel asks, respond to us? Do the self-speaking entities we attend and respond to in nature ever give us their full attention, engage us, respond to our claims? The answer, he is convinced, is no. The sounds of nature, he suggests, are more like the commands of a monarch who is deaf to his subjects but compels their obedience. Secondly, a conversation is necessarily about something. It enables participants to compare each other's perceptions of the world in the common task of figuring out how it actually is. Human interlocutors do this, but birds, trees, rivers, thunder, and the winds do not. It is not that they are irresponsible interlocutors. Rather, they are not interlocutors at all. For Vogel, then, the silence of nature means that however much noise it makes, it takes no part in the conversations we hold about it. It might sound to us as if nature is speaking, but that is a delusion. I have listened carefully, writes Vogel, and I hear nothing. Recall the old Ojibwe man and the thunderbird. He thought the thunder was speaking to him, but could not comprehend what it said. Was this a failure of translation, as Hollowell seems to suggest? I have argued that it was a failure of empathy. For Vogel, however, had the old man comprehended thunder's speech, he would have succeeded neither in translating it nor in empathizing with it. He would have rather performed an act of ventriloquism. For whereas the translator speaks for another but in his own tongue, the ventriloquist projects his own words onto a mute object, while creating the illusion that it is the object speaking for itself. Okay. I like that term, ventriloquism. I mean, that could be sort of brought over into the Feuerbachian critique, right? Which is that theology is just a reified anthropology, which seems to kind of map directly onto what Ingold is talking about here as well, as it relates to nature. Okay, this charge of ventriloquism is the foundation for the scientific abhorrence of anthropomorphism, where those who claim empathy with non-human creatures, or to know what they are feeling, stand accused of projecting their own thoughts and sentiments onto their unwitting subjects. It seems to me like there's a relevance here too, to some extent, with certain kinds of speculative realism. I have to think about that. The accusation, however, has not gone unchallenged. In a debate conducted in the pages of the journal Environmental Values, Nicole Klenk has entered on the other side. She replies that non-humans can and do respond to human voice, gesture, and presence in ways that are meaningful both to them and to us. It is true that non-humans may not compare their perceptions of the environment with humans in a collaborative effort to establish the truth of what is actually out there. But to insist that conversations can only take this form, Klenk argues, is to take such a narrow view of conversation that it would exclude most of what we commonly call conversation in the human world. For most people, most of the time, conversation is a matter of understanding what others are telling us, of getting the story right, not of verifying the rightness of the story. Thus, human beings who take it upon themselves to render in words what nature is saying are indeed translators and not ventriloquists. For Klenk, this is precisely what happens in scientific work. Were this not the case, she concludes, scientific interpretations would be mere fictions created through dialogue among humans, rather than the results of careful interaction with and observation of components of the natural world. But in this, I believe Klenk is mistaken. Or more to the point, she is mistaken so long as we remain bound by the methodological protocols of normal science. For the claim of science is that, as a specialized knowledge practice, it does seek to verify the rightness of the story, rather than merely getting the story right. Ever since Bacon, science has insisted on discovering the truth of what is there, and thus on the strict separation of fact and interpretation. Reading what is on the lines of the book of nature, rather than between them, the one thing that scientists insist that they do not do is what Klenk takes to be their number one priority: to listen to the voices of those beings they interact with. Arguably, indeed, scientists do all they can to avoid listening, for fear that it would interfere with or compromise the objectivity of their results. So there is, I contend, a real parallel in the modern constitution between the book of nature and the nature of the book, each understood as a completed work whose contents can be deciphered by those with the keys to do so. Yes. The parallel lies in the idea that both are to be read in silence, not in the course of an ongoing conversation whose manifold participants open up to one another and whose stories intertwine, but as a record of results that, rendered inert and impassive, in objective and objectified forms, have turned their back on us, presenting to our inspection only what Mei Wan Ho has called an opaque, flat, frozen surface of literalness. To science, the facts are given, they comprise the data. But the world does not ostensibly give of itself to science as part of any offering or commitment. What is given in science is that which has fallen out of circulation and has settled as a kind of residue, cast off from the give and take of life. It is this residue, dredged, sampled, and purified, that is then subjected to a process of analysis, the end results of which appear on the written page in the form of words, figures, and diagrams. Thus the knowledge so constituted is created as an overlay or wraparound on the outside of being. Having silenced the world, we find knowledge in the silence of the book. It's so good. So rich. Okay. Next section heading, Knowing in Being. The very concept of the human, in its modern incarnation, expresses the dilemma of a creature that can know the world, of which it is existentially a part, only by taking leave of it. Yet in our experience as inhabitants, moving through the world rather than roaming its outer surface, our knowledge is not built up as an external accretion, but grows and unfolds from the very inside of our earthly being. We grow into the world as the world grows into us. Perhaps this grounding of knowing in being lies at the heart of the kind of sensibility we are apt to call religious. It is all the more ironic, then, that leaders of the Reformation should have campaigned, in the name of religion, to turn the relation between knowing and being inside out. Yes, in so doing, they assisted materially in the birth of empirical science. Yes, and I think there are strong parallels here, this could easily map onto the sort of death of God narrative as well. And in fact, most people many people trace the so-called death of God back to the Reformation. So that Christianity is actually what gives birth to secularity. Okay, and a lot of people have done work on that. In so doing, they assisted materially in the birth of empirical science. As Harrison observes, the Reformists stress on the ostensive truth of words and works, while proceeding from the purest of religious motives, inadvertently set in train a process that would eventually undermine the biblical authority they were so keen to promote. Inevitably, the religion of the reformist was trumped by the very science it unloosed. For in any contest over the facts, science is bound to win, and religion to lose, leaving the puzzle of why people, including many scientists, tenaciously adhere to representations of reality that are demonstrably false. Yet questions about which can better represent the world, religion or science, are wrongly posed. For the real contest lies elsewhere. It turns on whether our ways of knowing and imagining are enshrined within an existential commitment to the world in which we find ourselves. It is a contest, in Candler's terms, between the grammar of representation, which disowns such commitment, and the grammar of participation, which depends on it. Philosopher Michel Serres draws our attention to the derivation of religion, according to an interpretation attributed to Cicero from the Latin relegere, which means to reread, in that sense of reading which we have already identified as taking counsel, and of being receptive to what one's textual interlocutors have to offer. What, then, is its opposite? It is negligere, to not read. It is to fail to take heed, to neglect or cast aside those offerings, to refuse the commitments that their acceptance would entail. Whoever has no religion, Serres concludes, should not be called an atheist or unbeliever, but negligent. The opposite of religion, then, is negligence. I love that so much. So good. But if rereadings or retellings cast in the performative grammar of participation are refracted through the distorting lens of a cognitive grammar of representation that neglects or denies, a priori, the very commitments on which participation depends, then they are bound to be thrown up as a spectrum of apparently irrational beliefs in entities, such as spirits, and, of course, dragons, which, if they existed in fact, would violate obvious principles of physical or biological causation. Just such a fate was suffered by one of the more celebrated dragons of anthropological literature, the one that Philet, an old man among the Dorze of southern Ethiopia, challenged anthropologist Dan Sperber to kill. It was reputedly gold all over, had a heart of gold and one horn on the nape of its neck, and lived not far away. For the rational anthropologist, a stranger to participation, commitment, and the passion that infuses it, or, in a word, to faith. Philett's challenge evidenced a certain representational belief of semi-propositional content, meaning that the content itself was but partially understood and open to multiple interpretations. Yet, as John Morton has shown in a critical review, to dismiss Philett's heartfelt conviction concerning the dragon's existence in these terms is clearly to do some violence to that conviction, disposing in particular with its affective qualities. For like the dragon encountered by the monk in the story of Saint Benedict, Philett's version was, in Morton's reappraisal, the outward form of his inner emotional state. The dragon was a topos. I don't know how to say that. I fucking hate Latin. The dragon was a topos in the field of participation, not a half-baked proposition in the field of representation. As this example shows, comparisons of religion and science in terms of the tenacity of apparently irrational beliefs build a stance of denial into their founding axioms, a denial amongst their adherents that in their conscious deliberations, whether scientific or spiritual, the world owes anything to them or they to the world. In other words, negligence has become the foundation for a debate about the rationality of beliefs about the world. But if, to the contrary, it is acknowledged that we owe our very existence to the world, and if the world, at least in some measure, owes its existence to us, then we need to ask instead, what is the nature of these ownings, these commitments? What do we give back, asks Serres, to the objects of our science from which we take knowledge? Or to put the same question in another way, how can our ways of knowing and of imagining let us, and the creatures around us, be? So it has like a sort of Heideggerian tonalities there. For it is surely in their discharge into being that the common ground between religion and science is to be found. This is where Clank might be right after all. All science depends on observation, and observation depends in turn on an intimate coupling, in perception and action, of the observer with those aspects of the world that are the focus of attention. Perhaps the most striking characteristic of modern science lies in the lengths to which it has gone to deny or cover up the practical, observational commitments on which it depends. To highlight these commitments, to attend to the practices of science rather than its formal prescriptions, means recovering those very experiential and performative engagements which, unwritten and unsung, have fallen through the cracks or been pushed into the wings of scientific conceptualizations. Let us not forget the advice of Auguste Kekulé. I know I'm saying that wrong, but I don't care. To follow every footprint, twig, and fallen leaf. In practice, scientists are as much wayfarers as are people of faith, and must perforce tread where others have gone before, ever attentive and responsive to the rustlings and whisperings of their surroundings. Joining with things in the processes of their formation, rather than merely being informed by what is already precipitated out, practicing scientists do not just collect, but accept what the world has to offer them. They may, in deference to official protocols, feign not to listen to the voices of beings around them, but listen they must if they are to advance beyond the bare pickup of information towards real understanding. Like it or not, they too are beholden to the world, and it is this more humble profession, rather than in arrogating to itself the exclusive authority to represent a given reality, that scientific inquiry converges with religious sensibility as a way of knowing in being. This is the way of imagination. Let me be clear. To follow this way is not to reach an accommodation between science and religion, nor is it to create a space where religion can flourish alongside science in easy accord, with their labors neatly divided between the spiritual and the material sides of things. In contemporary debates on religion and science, at least in Western societies, declarations to this effect have become almost routine, whether from practicing scientists who claim to have embraced religious faith, or from reasonable churchmen anxious to appear friendly to science. Such declarations, however, invariably take as their point of departure the very separation I have sought to repair, of the life of the spirit from its material matrix, or of imagination from reality. My contention is precisely the reverse, namely, that if it is to be conducted ethically, with care, attentiveness, and commitment, and with due acknowledgement of our debt to the world for what it has to teach us, then science is religion in action. And conversely, as a disciplined, systematic, but open-ended way of knowing and being, religion must at heart be a practice of science. Where science and religion converge, moreover, so too do anthropology and theology. This conclusion points to a certain realignment between the two disciplines. Up to now, as Joel Robbins observes, anthropologists have for the most part approached theology in one or other of two ways. Either they have found in theology an aid to disciplinary self-reflection and critique in revealing how key concepts such as culture, nature, agency, and even religion have their roots in the Judeo-Christian tradition, or they have treated theologians as informants and their writings as just another source of ethnographic data on the very Christian culture that informs them. Neither approach has dented the division between ethnographic data and social theory, with which contemporary anthropology, in keeping with the protocols of normal science, remains largely compliant. This division, Robbins suggests, is the breakdown product of a decayed theology. There is, however, a third way. It is to turn to others for what they have to teach us of knowing in the world as a form of commitment, of being and letting be, and to find in the ontological and ethical force of this commitment a foundation for hope. It is in this spirit that I turn from the teachings of medieval monasticism to one final example from the circumpolar north. All right, the next section here is called The Bible and the Land. The example comes from a recent study by Peter Louvers, carried out among, wow, that's a word, Tlilit-Gwich'in people living in and around Fort McPherson in the Canadian Northwest Territories. The study is exceptional in combining a sensitive account of the ways in which people relate to their environment as they hunt, trap, and move around on the land and water, with a detailed history of Gwich'in's engagement with the written word, Gwich'in engagements with the written word, above all in the translation and reception of the Christian Bible. The immense work of translation was undertaken by Archdeacon Robert MacDonald, born in 1829 of a Scottish father, an employee of the Hudson's Bay Company, and an Ojibwe mother. MacDonald was educated at the Anglican Mission School in the Red River settlement and spent a decade serving with the Ojibwe people before embarking, in 1862, on a mission to bring the Anglican faith to the people of the Mackenzie River District. Over the ensuing years, MacDonald worked tirelessly to introduce Christian writings to native Gwich'in communities, and many of the men and women he encountered on his travels became key advisors in helping him to transcribe liturgical texts into their own language, known at the time as Taduk. For MacDonald, the translation of the entire Bible into Taduk was a lifelong endeavor, and the work was not completed until 1898. Though the Taduk Bible was warmly received by the Gwich'in, this reception was not quite as MacDonald intended. Unlike his rivals from the Catholic mission, who took a rather more relaxed attitude, MacDonald was steeped in the traditions of the Reformed Church and believed that the text of the Bible was to be read literally, as the unalterable record of a singular truth that is not open to negotiation. Much to his discomfort, however, many Gwich'in people, including several of MacDonald's own pupils, began to experience dreams and visions in which, it seemed, the pages of the Bible were talking to them, issuing instructions and revealing prophecies. These pages spoke with the voices of their elders, the people with whom MacDonald had been working in transcribing the text, and whose particular dialectical idiosyncrasies had become incorporated into it, and even with the voice of MacDonald himself. Thus, for the Gwich'in, to read the Bible was to open up a conversation with these elders, to listen to their voices, to be taught by them, and to learn. For his part, MacDonald was mightily displeased and felt compelled to denounce the false prophecies that were being mouthed by the people. The mismatch between these ways of reading was not, however, confined to the Bible. It has continued to surface in other contexts, notably in the interpretation of treaties and land claims agreements drawn up with officials of the Canadian government. In these cases, the dismay was on the side of the Gwich'in, who were surprised to discover that documents which they had thought to open up to ongoing dialogue with those whose voices were incorporated therein were treated by officialdom as set in stone, silent, and unyielding. Exactly the same mismatch as Louvers shows can be found in ways of reading the land. For colonizers, explorers, scientists, and others who have come to the land from outside, whether on a mission to civilize it, to develop it, to research it, or to appreciate its natural beauty, there is no disputing that what is there is already fixed, awaiting discovery, explanation, and possibly transformation by the hands and minds of men. For the Gwich'in, however, it is quite different. To read the land for them is to attend to the multiple clues that reveal the activities and intentions of its manifold human and more than human inhabitants. These clues, Louvers tells us, include animal movements, trails, old and new camps and cabins, marks on the land, wood, snow and ice, conditions in winter, riverbanks in summer, and places where events have unfolded. Wherever they go, Gwich'in are listening, remembering, learning, taking counsel from the land. It is their teacher, not just a repository from which can be extracted materials for the construction of propositional knowledge. Thus the land speaks to people with many voices, just as the Bible does. Should we then go along with Archdeacon MacDonald and conclude that such a way of reading the land is equally false, or that it rests on the kinds of delusions to which, in Western colonial eyes, allegedly primitive native peoples have always been supposed to be prone? Even MacDonald, with his Ojibwe upbringing, would have known that there is more to indigenous understanding than this. And so, in light of what I have argued in this article, do we? I have shown how studies of medieval monasticism and of indigenous ontologies point to alternative ways of reading and of writing, which might allow us once again to take counsel from both the voices of the pages and the world around us, to listen and to be advised by what they are telling us, and thereby to heal the rupture between the world and our imagination of it. This healing, I contend, must be a first step towards establishing a more open-ended and sustainable way to live. That's the end of the article. There's some lengthy notes here. And then the citation. So I absolutely love that article. Every time I read it, I get something. I get something from it. And I mean, I think he's absolutely right. As to the strength of the scholarship, there's certain things that I just can't speak on. I'm just sort of taking what he's saying sort of at face value. I don't really kind of pore over the citations and worry about that so much. But this has been a great article for me to share, although I don't think typically the people that I share this article with, I feel aren't able to appreciate it, but would most benefit from it. And that's typically, I think, because there's a sort of, I don't know what to call it. Well, in certain cases, there are folks who are just sort of adherents to a kind of scientism, and I think a lot of the language in here, the theological language, the sort of emphasis on the phenomenal, is just sort of a little bit foreign to them, and so aren't able to kind of onboard the strength of the argument that's being made here. But anyway, so yeah, I'm trying to think what I'm going to start reading tomorrow. I have my friend Adam actually requested that I revisit a book by Mary Jane Rubenstein called Strange Wonder. I mean, she's fantastic. So I might do that. And that was a great book. I mean, it's been a few years now, but I wouldn't mind revisiting it. As I recall, there's this section in the middle that, at the time when I was reading it, was largely opaque to me. Had something to do with like a beaver or a wombat or something, or some kind of like rodent. And I was just like, I don't know what's going on here. Something to do with a rodent and Kierkegaard. Or actually, my friend Matt recently shared an article with me that was very good. Sort of problematizing or Bennett's some of Bennett's work, vibrant materialism, sort of the obsession with anthropomorphism. Yeah, I think I'll revisit that article. I'll do that tomorrow, and then maybe I'll start on. I'll dig into a book after that. All right, y'all. Have a good day. Bye.